to the Country Watch Political Intelligence Briefing Quick Hits, briefing of the hot stories across the world in brief. I'm Denise Youngblood Coleman, the Editor-in-Chief and Senior International Affairs Analyst at Country Watch. This week, the featured country is North Korea. Ballistic missile tests from the two Koreas a few weeks ago, within hours of one another, could only be understood as signs of tension on the Korean peninsula. That tension was emphasized on September the 28th when the South Korean military said that North Korea had fired an unidentified projectile into the sea off its east coast. South Korea's Joint Chiefs of Staff offered no other details at the time, although the action by the North represented some measure of brinkmanship. By September the 29th, Korean time, it was initially reported that North Korea fired a short-range ballistic missile. State-controlled media KCNA announced that North Korea had tested the Hwasong-8 hypersonic weapon. Earlier in 2021, North Korea had expressed its interest in developing hypersonic weapons technology. Typically, a hypersonic weapon would be launched using a conventional rocket booster. It would convey a detachable glide body that separates from the rocket. At that point, the hypersonic glide vehicle would no longer be able to accelerate, but would maintain guiding maneuverability with the aim of hitting a given target. Clearly, the maneuverability aspects and flight path unpredictability make hypersonic weapons both dangerous and hard to intercept with anti-missile defense systems. Kim Jong-un claimed in January of this year that North Korea had finished research into developing warheads of different combat missions, including the hypersonic gliding flight warheads for the new type of ballistic rockets, and was making preparations for their test manufacture. Only a handful of countries, China and Russia, have developed hypersonic missiles weaponry. It was unclear if this particular hypersonic missile tested in late September by North Korea was actually a hypersonic weapon in the same way as China or Russia could claim. On September 30th, Korean time, South Korea said that its new analysis of North Korea's hypersonic missile test indicated that the weapon was still in the early stages of development. According to Will Ripley for CNN, South Korean analysis indicated that it would take considerable time for the weapon to be deployed, and this particular missile was still capable of being intercepted by anti-missile defense systems. This test launch activity by North Korea in September 2021 did not simply demonstrate its ability to launch a missile with nuclear capability. The test firing of cruise and ballistic missiles showed first the progress being made with North Korea's missile technology and nuclear weapons program, and second, the failure to stop it. It also underlined the failure of face-to-face negotiations between former United States President Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, in achieving denuclearization on the Korean peninsula. Moving on to Germany, the Social Democrats have won the most seats in the elections to the Bundestag, with Angela Merkel stepping down from her post. Center-right CDU-CSU would be contesting the election of 2021 with Armin Laschet at the helm this time. At the helm of the center-left SPD, that would be the Social Democrats, it would be Olaf Scholz. Other parties in contention included the Greens, the Left Party, the Free Democratic Party, and the far-right xenophobic Alternative for Democracy, Alternative for Germany. It goes by the acronym AFD. On election day, Germans went to the polls to cast their ballots. After the polling stations closed and the vote count began, the Social Democrats were leading the CDU-CSU, albeit only by a percentage point or two, thus indicating a very close race. As the vote counting continued, it was apparent that the Social Democrats, their lead would hold, and exit poll data appeared to bear that out. The SPD, that would be the Social Democrats of Scholz, would win 25.8% of the vote share and the plurality of seats, 205. The CDU-CSU bloc of Laschet was on track to win 24.1% of the vote share and 194 seats. On the basis of these results and its apparent victory, the SPD's Scholz claimed a clear mandate for forming a pragmatic government. Laschet of the CDU-CSU, who was seeking to succeed Merkel as chancellor, was officially rejecting the election results and vowing to build a coalition of his own. Meanwhile, there were a number of smaller parties eager to play kingmaker roles. At the top of that list would be the Greens and the FDP. There's a strong possibility of a traffic light coalition composed of the SPD in red, FDP yellow, and Greens green. Laschet would likely try to form the Jamaica coalition of the CDU, CSU black, FDP yellow, and Greens green. Another coalition could be the Kenya coalition, made up of the SPD red, the CDU, CSU black, and the Greens green. Of course, a grand coalition made up of the SPD red and the CDU, CSU black was also a possibility. Regardless of how these rival coalition efforts were to transpire, it was expected to take some time. In the interim, Merkel would remain at the helm as chancellor. That being said, the chance of a future Chancellor Scholz was more likely than a Chancellor Laschet. Staying in Europe, there was a referendum in the micronation state of San Marino on the issue of abortion rights. The historic referendum ended with voters overwhelmingly ratifying the motion to allow women to terminate a pregnancy up to 12 weeks. In San Marino, ahead of the referendum, there was a total ban on abortion, with women facing a penalty of 3 years in prison for ending pregnancies and doctors conducting the procedure facing a penalty of 6 years. With more than 77% of voters approving the measures, the result of the referendum could only be understood as decisive and moved San Marino to terrain common across Europe. The remaining countries in Europe with total prohibitions on abortion are the Holy See, also known as the Vatican, Andorra, and Malta. On September 27th, Senate Republicans blocked the bill that would have funded the government past the September 30th deadline and suspended the US debt ceiling. Every Republican in the Senate voted no on the motion. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer said on Twitter, Trump racked up $8 trillion in new debt. Rather than pay the bills, Senate Republicans voted to default. They solidified themselves as the party of default. By September 29th, a deal had been reached to ensure that the legislation would be passed in Congress to keep the government open until December 3rd. The continuing resolution was passed by the September 30th deadline. In the House of Representatives, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi had earlier indicated, in addition to resolving the debt ceiling crisis, the lower chamber would be taking up two measures. At stake would be the bipartisan infrastructure deal that passed the Senate with the support of every Democrat and 19 Republicans. That $1 trillion bill included $550 billion in new funding for roads, building, public transportation, rural broadband, and other infrastructure. Also at stake would be the $3.5 trillion reconciliation package to fund President Joe Biden's domestic agenda. With bipartisan infrastructure bill becoming inextricably linked to the reconciliation package, with the internecine battles emerging between the progressive and moderate wings of the Democratic Party, there was some skepticism about the passage of legislation. On September 29th, Manu Raju for CNN reported Speaker Pelosi wanted substantive movement towards passing the reconciliation bill before she put the bipartisan infrastructure legislation to a vote on the floor. Next week, I'll cover developments related to the fate of infrastructure legislation. Also on the agenda, the Japanese ruling party's leadership race and impending election, Bolsonaro's continued attempt to strain constitutional norms in order to hold on to power in Brazil, the post-election government formation process in Germany, the conviction and jail sentence of former French President Nicolas Sarkozy, and the new Prime Minister for Tunisia. In the coming weeks, I'll also be covering the Taliban's desire for international legitimacy and recognition, and the West's effort to use that leverage against the Taliban. The proposed government in exile in Afghanistan will also be covered, as well as the economic crisis looming in Afghanistan. A lot of this coverage can be accessed via my comprehensive Afghanistan withdrawal report called Sunset in the Graveyard of Empires, which will be available for purchase on the CountryWatch website at www.countrywatch.com in the forthcoming weeks. Thank you for your time. And remember now, more than ever, we live in an interconnected world.